The old wooden boards creaked under his boots as he walked across the porch for what felt like the 100th time that day. The paint was peeling off the railings, just like everything else around this place was falling apart. He stopped at the edge and looked out at what used to be his pride and joy. The ranch stretched out before him, but it wasn't the same place it had been just 6 months ago. The grass was brown and brittle from the worst drought anyone could remember. His cattle stood in whatever shade they could find, looking as tired and beaten down as he felt. Some of them were getting sick, and he didn't have the money to call the vet anymore. He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the rough stubble that had grown longer than his wife would have ever let him keep it. She always used to tease him about looking like a mountain man when he forgot to shave. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest, just like all the other memories did these days. 3 months. It had only been 3 months since the cancer finally won. 3 months since he watched the strongest woman he'd ever known fade away in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed but couldn't save her. 3 months since he'd become completely and utterly alone. The medical bills were stacked on the kitchen table inside, held down by an old coffee mug so they wouldn't blow away when he opened the windows. He'd stopped opening them, though. Even looking at those numbers made his stomach turn. $47,000. That's what it costs to watch someone you love die slowly. One treatment at a time. The bank had been calling every day for 2 weeks now. He'd stopped answering the phone. What was the point? He knew what they wanted to talk about. The mortgage was 3 months behind, and they weren't going to wait much longer. Soon enough, some guy in a suit would drive up that dusty road and hand him papers that would make this place belong to someone else. He walked down the steps and headed toward the old red barn. His boots kicked up little clouds of dust with every step. Even the dirt seemed angry at him. Inside the barn, he could hear one of the horses nickering softly. At least somebody around here still had some fight left in them. The barn doors groaned as he pushed them open. The smell of hay and leather hit him, bringing back 1,000 memories of better times. His horse, a gentle mare named Buttercup, came over to nuzzle his shoulder. She was probably the only living thing on this ranch that still seemed happy to see him. "Hey there, girl," he whispered, scratching behind her ears. "I know you're hungry. We're all hungry these days." The feed bins were nearly empty. He'd been stretching what he had left, giving the animals smaller portions, hoping somehow it would last longer. But math was math, and hope didn't fill empty stomachs. He grabbed a small scoop of oats and poured them into her trough. She ate gratefully while he leaned against the stall door and watched. Even something as simple as feeding his horse felt overwhelming these days. Everything took so much effort when your heart felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the barn floor. Soon it would be evening, then night, then another long morning of waking up to the same problems. He'd been living the same day over and over for months now, just trying to make it through each one without completely falling apart. Back in the house, the silence was deafening. Their house had never been quiet when she was alive. She was always humming while she cooked, or calling out to him from the garden, or playing music on the old radio in the living room. Now the only sounds were the tick of the clock on the wall, and the occasional groan of the old house settling on its foundation. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, but there wasn't much inside it. A few cans of soup, some bread that was getting stale, and a carton of milk that was probably going bad. He'd been living on the bare minimum, spending what little money he had left on feed for the animals instead of groceries for himself. He opened a can of vegetable soup and heated it up on the stove. The same dinner he'd had for the past 4 nights. As he stirred it, he caught sight of their wedding photo on the windowsill above the sink. They looked so young, so hopeful. She was wearing that white dress with the tiny flowers on it, and he was in his best suit, grinning like he'd won the lottery. In a way, he had won the lottery. 22 years with the most amazing woman in the world. 22 years of laughter and love and building something together. But now that it was over, those 22 years felt both like a lifetime and like they'd passed in the blink of an eye. He sat down at the kitchen table with his soup, pushing aside some of the bills to make room for his bowl. The numbers on those papers seemed to mock him. How had everything gotten so expensive? The treatments, the hospital stays, the medications that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Insurance had covered some of it, but not nearly enough. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of the Clearwater River running along the edge of his property. It was one of the few things that hadn't changed. The water kept flowing, just like it had when he was a kid, just like it had when he and his wife used to walk down there in the evenings to watch the sunset. They'd had their first kiss by that river under the old oak tree that was probably 100 years old. They'd talked about their future there, made plans, shared dreams. She used to say the sound of the water was like nature's lullaby, peaceful and constant and reassuring. Now it just reminded him of everything he'd lost as darkness settled over. The ranch, he found himself back on the porch, staring out at the empty fields. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the country sky, far from any city lights. She used to love looking at the stars. She knew all the constellations and would point them out to him, telling him the old stories about hunters and bears and mythical creatures. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same struggles. The animals would need feeding, the bills would still be there, the phone would probably ring with more bad news. But tonight, for just a few minutes, he let himself remember what it felt like when this place was full of life and love and possibility. The river kept running in the distance, and somewhere in its steady rhythm, he found just enough strength to face another day. The sound cut through the afternoon air like a knife, high-pitched, desperate, and absolutely terrifying. He'd been sitting on his porch steps, staring at nothing in particular, when those screams reached his ears. For a split second, he thought, maybe he was hearing things. His mind had been playing tricks on him lately, making him think he heard his wife calling his name or the phone ringing when it wasn't. But this was different, this was real. And it was coming from the direction of the river. He jumped up so fast that his old bones protested, but he didn't care. Those weren't the sounds of kids playing. These were screams of pure terror, the kind that made every parent in the world drop everything and run toward the danger. His boots pounded against the dry ground as he ran through his property. Past the barn, past the withered vegetable garden, toward the tree line that bordered the Clearwater River. The screaming was getting louder, more frantic, and now he could hear splashing mixed in with the cries for help when he broke through the trees and saw the river. His heart nearly stopped. The spring melt had made the water higher and faster than usual, and there, in the middle of the rushing current, were two small figures being swept downstream. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was trying desperately to keep his head above water while reaching for a younger girl who kept disappearing under the surface. "Help us! Please!" The boy was screaming, his voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. The man didn't think. He didn't consider that he was 53 years old, that he hadn't been in shape for months, that the water was ice cold from mountain snow, or that he might not have the strength to save them. All he saw were 2 children who were about to die if someone didn't act right now. He kicked off his boots and dove into the river. The shock of the cold water hit him like a sledgehammer. It knocked the breath right out of his lungs and made his muscles seize up for a terrifying moment. But he forced himself to move, to swim toward the children who were being carried further downstream with every second. The current was stronger than he'd expected, much stronger. It grabbed him and tried to pull him along with it, and he had to fight just to stay in control. His clothes were weighing him down, dragging at his arms and legs as he struggled to reach the kids. The little girl went under again, and this time she didn't come back up. The boy was screaming her name, diving down to try to find her, but the water was murky and moving too fast. Panic shot through the man's chest. He pushed himself harder, swimming with everything he had left. His lungs were burning, his arms felt like lead, but he kept going. These children were not going to die. Not on his watch. Not when he could do something about it. He reached the spot where he'd seen the girl go down and took a deep breath before diving under. The water was dark and cold, filled with bits of debris from upstream. He felt around blindly, his hands searching desperately until finally, his fingers touched fabric, He grabbed hold and pulled up hard, breaking the surface with the little girl in his arms. She was unconscious, her lips blue from the cold, but she was breathing. Barely, but breathing. The boy had managed to grab onto a fallen tree branch that was sticking out of the water about 20 yards downstream. He was holding on for dear life, his knuckles white from the effort. "Hold on!" The man shouted over the sound of the rushing water. "I'm coming." Swimming with an unconscious child in his arms was like trying to swim through concrete. Every stroke was a monumental effort, and the current kept trying to tear them both away. But somehow, step by step, stroke by stroke, he managed to work his way over to where the boy was clinging to the branch. "Grab my shoulders," he told the boy. "Hold on tight and don't let go." The kid didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around the man's neck and held on like his life depended on it, which it did. Now the man had both children, one unconscious in his arms and one clinging to his back, and he had to get all three of them to shore. The nearest bank looked impossibly far away. His legs were cramping from the cold, his arms were shaking from exhaustion, and he could feel his strength fading fast. But every time he thought about giving up, he felt the little girl's shallow breathing against his chest and the boy's frightened grip on his shoulders, and he found the energy to keep going, inch by inch, stroke by stroke. He fought his way across the current toward the muddy bank. The boy was crying now, scared and cold and probably in shock, but he never loosened his grip. The man kept talking to him, telling him they were going to be okay, that they were almost there, even though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. When his feet finally touched the bottom near the shore, his legs almost gave out from relief. He stumbled forward through the shallow water, still carrying both children, until he could collapse on the muddy bank. The little girl was still unconscious, her skin frighteningly pale. He laid her on her side and checked to make sure she was still breathing. Water trickled out of her mouth and she coughed weakly, which was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. The boy was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. "Is she okay? Is she going to be okay?" "She's going to be fine," the man said, though he wasn't entirely sure. He pulled off his soaked flannel shirt and wrapped it around the little girl, then gathered both children close to his body to try to warm them up. They were all soaking wet, covered in mud, and shaking from cold and shock. But they were alive. All three of them were alive, and that was what mattered. "What are your names?" he asked gently as he rubbed the boy's back to try to warm him up. "I'm Danny," the boy said through chattering teeth. "And that's my sister Lily. We were just playing by the water and she slipped on a rock and fell in. I tried to grab her, but I fell in too." "You were very brave," the man told him. "You tried to save your sister. That took real courage." Danny started crying again, this time from relief instead of fear. "I thought we were going to die. I thought I was going to lose her." The man pulled both children closer, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Purpose, the need to protect and care for someone other than himself. For the first time since his wife died, he felt like he mattered again. "You didn't lose her," he said softly. "She's right here, and she's safe. You're both safe now." As they sat there on the muddy riverbank, warming each other up and catching their breath, he realized that in trying to save these two children, something inside him had been saved too. Back at his house, the man wrapped both children in every blanket he could find. They were still shivering, but their color was starting to come back. Little Lily had woken up fully and was clinging to her brother like he was the only solid thing in the world. "Are you feeling better, sweetheart?" he asked her gently as he handed her a cup of hot chocolate he'd made from an old packet he found in the back of his cupboard. She nodded, her big eyes still wide with fear, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you for saving us," she whispered, his heart squeezed tight in his chest. When was the last time someone had thanked him for anything? When was the last time he'd felt like he'd actually helped someone instead of just taking up space in the world? "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad you're both okay." Danny was sitting next to his sister, still keeping one protective arm around her shoulders. The boy had been through something terrible, but he was trying to be brave for her sake. The man recognized that kind of strength. He'd seen it in his wife during her final weeks. Now, he said, settling into his old armchair across from them, I need to call your parents. They must be worried sick about you two. The moment he said the word parents, both children went very quiet. They looked at each other with an expression that seemed too serious for kids their age. Danny bit his lip and Lily looked down at her hands. Is there something wrong? The man asked gently. Are you hurt somewhere I can't see? No, sir, Danny said quickly. We're not hurt. It's just, well, there's only our mom. Our dad died when Lily was really little. The man felt a familiar pang in his chest. These kids knew what it was like to lose someone important, too. I'm sorry to hear that, he said softly. That must be really hard. It's okay, Danny said, though his voice suggested it wasn't really okay at all. Mom takes good care of us. She's a doctor at the hospital in town. A doctor? The man perked up. That's wonderful. What kind of doctor is she? She helps people who are really, really sick, Lily said in her small voice. Like people with cancer and stuff? The word cancer hit him like a physical blow. His throat went dry, and for a moment he couldn't breathe properly. There were probably lots of doctors who treated cancer patients. It didn't have to mean anything. What's your mom's name? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Rodriguez, Danny said. Her first name is Maria, but everyone at the hospital calls her Dr. Rodriguez. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Dr. Maria Rodriguez. He knew that name. He knew it very, very well. Does she Does she have dark hair that she wears pulled back? And does she have a small scar on her hand from when she was little? Both children looked surprised. How do you know about the scar? Danny asked. She got that from falling off her bike when she was 7. The man's hand started shaking. Dr. Maria Rodriguez, the oncologist who had spent months fighting to save his wife's life. The doctor who had worked longer hours than anyone should work, who had tried treatment after treatment, who had never given up hope even when everyone else had, the same doctor, who had held his wife's hand during those final moments when he couldn't bear to watch. The woman who had fought tears in her eyes as she told him there was nothing more they could do. I think, he said carefully, I might know your mother. The children looked at each other again, confused. She treated my wife, he continued, his voice getting quieter. About 6 months ago, my wife had cancer and Dr. Rodriguez was her doctor. Danny's eyes went wide. Is your wife better now? The question was so innocent, so hopeful, that it nearly broke his heart all over again. No, son, she died 3 months ago. Oh, Lily said in a very small voice. We're sorry, thank you, he managed. Your mother, she did everything she could. She's a very good doctor. But even as he said it, pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind. Things that hadn't made sense at the time. Like how Dr. Rodriguez had seemed to know exactly how much his insurance would cover, and how certain treatments had been marked as covered when he was pretty sure they shouldn't have been, like how she had always seemed to have time for extra appointments, even when the hospital was busy. How she had personally called to check on his wife, even on her days off. Like how the final bill had been so much lower than he'd expected, even though his wife had received months of intensive treatment. Can I use your phone to call your mom? He asked. She needs to know you're safe. Danny nodded and recited the number from memory. The man dialed, his hand still shaking slightly, and waited as it rang. Hello? The voice that answered was tired, stressed, and very familiar. Dr. Rodriguez, this is... Well, you probably don't remember me, but I'm the husband of Patricia Williams. She was your patient last year. There was a pause. Mr. Williams, of course I remember you. Is everything all right? Your children are here with me, he said quickly. They're safe, but there was an accident. They fell into the river and I pulled them out. They're okay, just cold and shaken up. He heard her sharp intake of breath. Oh my God, are they hurt? Do they need medical attention? They seem fine, but you should probably come check them over. I live on the old ranch about 3 miles south of town, right along the Clearwater River. I know exactly where that is, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like she was crying. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much. As he hung up the phone, Danny was looking at him with curious eyes. You said your wife was our mom's patient. What was her name? Patricia, he said, but everyone called her Patty. Patty Williams? Lily suddenly exclaimed. Mom has a picture of her on her desk at work. She talks about her sometimes. The man stared at her. She has a picture? Yeah, Danny said. Mom said she was one of the bravest people she ever knew. She said she wished she could have done more to help her. The room went very quiet. Outside, he could hear a car coming up the gravel driveway. Driving faster than was probably safe. In just a few minutes, he was going to come face to face with the woman who had fought so hard to save the most important person in his world. The woman who had been there during the worst period of his life, who had seen him at his most vulnerable and broken, and somehow, through the strangest twist of fate imaginable, he had just saved her children's lives. As the car doors slammed. Outside, he realized that everything was about to change again. The front door burst open without a knock, and Dr. Maria Rodriguez rushed in like a woman on fire. Her dark hair was messy, her scrubs were wrinkled, and there were tears streaming down her face before she even saw her children. Danny, Lily! She cried out, and both kids jumped up from the couch and ran straight into her arms. She dropped to her knees and pulled them both against her, holding them so tight it looked like she might never let go. Her whole body was shaking as she kissed their foreheads and ran her hands over their arms and faces, checking for injuries like only a mother and a doctor could do. Are you hurt? Are you okay? I was so scared, she whispered over and over, her voice breaking with relief and leftover terror. The man stood in the doorway watching this reunion, feeling like an intruder in this private moment. But he couldn't look away. There was something about seeing this strong, professional woman completely fall apart with love and fear for her children that reminded him of every parent who had ever existed. We're okay, Mama, Lily said, patting her mother's cheek like she was the one doing the comforting. This nice man saved us from the river. Dr. Rodriguez looked up at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the exact moment when recognition hit her. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened slightly in shock. Mr. Williams, she whispered. I can't believe. After everything you've been through, you saved my babies. She stood up slowly, still keeping one hand on each of her children, as if she couldn't bear to let them go. How can I ever thank you? How can I ever repay you for this? You don't need to repay me for anything, he said quietly. But I think maybe we need to talk. She nodded, understanding immediately. Kids, why don't you go get cleaned up and put on some dry clothes? There should be some spare things in the car. After the children headed outside, the two adults stood in his living room, looking at each other across a space that felt much bigger than it actually was. He could see her taking in the stacks of medical bills on his table, the bare refrigerator, the general sense of a man who had given up on taking care of himself. You look thin, she said softly, and it was so much like something his wife would have said that his throat tightened up. I've been better, he admitted, but I've been worse. Too. She sat down on his old couch and he noticed how exhausted she looked. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands had the slight tremor of someone who had been running on coffee and adrenaline for too long. How long has it been since you slept? He asked. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Really? Slept? I honestly can't remember. I work 3 shifts a week at the hospital, plus I pick up extra shifts whenever they need me. And then there's the private practice 2 days a week, and the free clinic on Saturdays. That's 7 days a week, he said, doing the math in his head. Sometimes 8, she said with a tired smile. There's a clinic in the next town over that. Calls me when they get cases they can't handle. He stared at her. When do you see your kids? That's the problem, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. I don't. Not nearly enough. Today was supposed to be my afternoon off, but there was an emergency at the hospital, and Mrs. Chun, who usually watches them, had to leave for her own family emergency, and I thought they'd be okay for a few hours. She put her head in her hands. They could have died because I wasn't there, because I'm never there when they need me. Why are you working so much? He asked gently. I mean, doctors make good money, right? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with something that looked like shame. Because I can't stop helping people, she said simply. Do you know how many families come to me who can't afford treatment? Do you know how many people die because they can't pay for the medicines that could save them? He thought about his own medical bills, about the crushing weight of trying to afford hope. So what do? He asked, though he was starting to suspect he already knew the answer. I pay for it, she said. Not officially, you understand. I can't just hand out free treatment or the hospital would fire me. But I know people. I know which tests can be coded differently, which treatments can be written off as research, which medications have patient assistance programs that nobody knows about. She stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the dried-up fields. And when none of that works, I pay the bills myself, all of them, as many as I can. I've got 3 credit cards maxed out, I borrowed against my house, and I haven't bought new clothes in 2 years. But people are alive because of it, so it's worth it. The pieces were all clicking into place now. My wife's treatment, he said slowly. The bills were lower than they should have been. She nodded without turning around. A lot lower. Your insurance was terrible, and some of the medications she needed weren't covered at all. But there were ways around it if you knew the right people and didn't mind bending a few rules. How much? He asked. How much did you pay out of your own pocket? It doesn't matter, she said. It matters to me. How much? She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally she said, $15,000, maybe a little more. The number hit him like a physical blow. $15,000. That was more money than he had in the world right now. She had spent $15,000 of her own money to try to save his wife, and he had never known. Why? He whispered. Why would you do that for strangers? She turned around then, and there were tears in her eyes again. Because I became a doctor to save people, not to watch them die because they couldn't afford to live. And because your wife, she was special. Special how? She never complained. Not once, not even during the worst treatments. She always asked about my kids, remembered their names, brought me pictures that Lily had drawn. She treated me like family instead of just another doctor, and when someone does that, she shrugged. You do whatever you can to help them. They stood there in silence, 2 people who had been broken by loss and sacrifice in different ways. Outside, they could hear the children playing, their laughter carrying through the open windows like music. I can't accept this, he said finally. I can't let you destroy yourself financially because you tried to save my wife. You can't stop me, she said with a small smile. It's already done. Then let me help you, he said. Let me help you figure out how to take care of your kids without killing yourself. She looked at him with surprise. You want to help me? After everything you've lost? Especially after everything I've lost, he said. Because I know what it feels like to be drowning. And today you showed me what it looks like when someone throws you a lifeline. 3 weeks later, the sound of children's laughter filled the old ranch house for the first time in years. Danny was chasing Lily around the kitchen table while she giggled and tried to escape with a cookie she'd swiped from the cooling rack. The man watched from the doorway, still amazed at how different everything felt. Danny, don't run in the house. Dr. Rodriguez called from where she was unpacking boxes in what used to be the guest room. But she was smiling as she said it, and there was no real scolding in her voice. It had started as a temporary arrangement. Just until she could get back on her feet financially and find a reliable babysitter. Just until she could figure out how to work fewer hours without letting her patients down. But somewhere along the way, temporary had started feeling like home. The ranch was coming back to life too. With Dr. Rodriguez's medical connections, they'd found a veterinarian who was willing to treat the sick cattle in exchange for help with his own financial problems. Word was spreading in the farming community about the doctor who actually cared about people who couldn't afford health care. Mr. Williams, Lily called out, running over to tug on his shirt sleeve. Can you teach me how to feed the chickens again? I forgot which ones are the mean ones. There aren't any mean ones, he said, scooping her up. They're just protective of their eggs. Kind of like how your mom is protective of you. Mama's not mean, though, Lily said seriously. No, she's not mean. She's just careful. There's a difference. Over. The past few weeks, he'd watched Dr. Rodriguez slowly start to relax. She was still working too much, but now she could come home to a place where her children were safe and happy instead of an empty apartment, where they'd been left with whatever babysitter she could afford that day, and he was learning what it felt like to have purpose again. "Danny, come help me with the horses," he called out. The boy dropped his book and came running. In just 3 weeks, Danny had become his shadow, following him around the ranch and asking endless questions about everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation. "Can I brush Buttercup today?" Danny asked as they walked toward the barn. "You can brush her every day if you want," the man said. "She likes you, I can tell." It was true. The old Mare had perked up considerably since the children arrived. She seemed to enjoy having small hands brush her coat and gentle voices talking to her while she ate inside the barn. Danny carefully brushed the horse's coat while chattering about everything and nothing. The boy had been quiet those first few days, still shaken from the river incident, but now he was making up for lost time. "Mr. Williams," Danny said suddenly, his voice more serious than usual, "are you going to marry my mom?" The brush stopped, moving in the man's hand. "That's a pretty big question, son." "What makes you ask that?" "Well, she smiles more now. And she doesn't cry when she thinks we're not looking. And you fixed the broken faucet in our bathroom, and you make sure there's always food in the refrigerator, and you help me with my math homework even though you're not very good at it." The man laughed despite himself. "Thanks for that last part." "I'm just saying," Danny continued, "you do all the stuff that dads are supposed to do. And we never had a dad who did those things." It was such an honest, simple way of looking at things that it took his breath away. "Out of the mouths of babes," as his wife used to say. "Your mom and I are still figuring things out," he said carefully. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I care about you and Lily very much. You're both special kids." Danny grinned. "Mom says you're special too. She says you saved us in more ways than one." That evening, after the children were asleep, he and Dr. Rodriguez sat on the porch steps, watching the stars come out. It had become their routine over the past week, this quiet time after the chaos of the day was over. "I got a call from the hospital today," she said. "They want me to cut back to 2 shifts a week instead of 3. That's good news, isn't it?" "It means less money," she said. "But it also means more time with the kids, and honestly, I think I might take it." "What changed your mind?" She was quiet for a moment, picking at the worn wood of the porch step. "Yesterday, Lily drew me a picture. At school, it was our family," she said. "There was me and Danny and her and you and Buttercup and all the chickens. We were all holding hands and smiling." She pulled the drawing out of her pocket and showed it to him. It was typical 6-year-old art, with stick figures that had enormous smiles and a house that looked more like a box than a building. But there was something about it that made his chest feel tight. "She's never drawn a picture with a dad figure in it before," Dr. Rodriguez said softly. "Not since her real father died. But there you are, right between her and Danny, holding both their hands." He studied the drawing in the dim porch light. "She gave me yellow hair," he noted. "My hair isn't yellow." "She told me yellow is the color of sunshine," Dr. Rodriguez said. "And sunshine makes everything grow better." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and the distant murmur of the river. It was the same river that had brought them all together. The same water that had nearly taken the children away, but had instead delivered them to exactly where they needed to be. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what we talked about that first day, about helping each other. What about it? What if we made it official? Not just you and the kids staying here temporarily, but really building something together. You could cut back on work, focus on the patients who really need you instead of killing yourself trying to save everyone. I could help with the kids, help you get your finances back on track. And what would you get out of it?" she asked. He looked out at his ranch, which was starting to look alive again thanks to her connections and the children's energy. Then he looked at her, this remarkable woman who had sacrificed everything to help others, including his beloved wife. I'd get a family, he said simply. I'd get to watch Danny learn how to take care of animals and see Lily discover that chickens aren't scary after all. I'd get to come home every day to people who are happy to see me. And maybe, if I'm really lucky, I'd get to fall in love again. She reached over and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. I think we might both be pretty lucky, she said. 6 months later, they were married by the river under the old oak tree, with Danny as his best man and Lily as the flower girl. The ranch was thriving again. Dr. Rodriguez had opened a small practice in town that focused on affordable care, and the house was filled with the sounds of a family that had found each other in the most unexpected way. Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. Sometimes saving someone else is exactly what you need to save yourself.